So these are three chapters that were originally one chapter, but one of the very useful interventions Tim has historically had in my reading is to convince me to break up chapters into shorter chapters, which is generally a good thing. The arc we're looking at is Stalin's death to 1968, which, both in the history of Eastern Europe in general and in the history of philosophy and in particular political philosophy in particular is a very special period. And it's the moment when the Marxist Hegelian tradition is really going to very intensely confront that phenomenological existentialist tradition. And those were like the two big games in town as far as continental philosophy goes. And there's a whole nother discussion we could have about the relationship between Nazism and Stalinism on one hand and the Enlightenment on the other. Like, how do we get from modern thought, to this totalitarian hell? But now we're going to be looking at how we get out of it. These are also things that had been percolating in my head for years. So back 30 years ago, when I was an MA student in Toronto, I was working on my master's thesis about the language of conversation and poetry to some extent among Czech and Slovak writers during the Stalinist period and after the Stalinist period. And in Czechoslovakia in particular, they were very, very reluctant to de-Stalinize. It takes a long time. The Poles were kind of more excited about it. But in Czechoslovakia, there was a real reluctance. And so Stalin dies in 1953, you all remember that. I keep reminding myself that eventually all these guys die. Every morning I get up and check to see, has Putin died, has Lukashenko died, has Trump died. Eventually they die, I cling to that hope. Stalin dies in March 1953. Gottwald, who is the communist leader of Czechoslovakia, dies of grief a few days later, or, heart attack or a stroke or whatever it is, but it's quite suspicious. And then there's a time gap, of course, as you all know. Stalin dies, and then it's almost 3 years passes before Khrushchev in Moscow gives that secret speech to the 20th Party Congress in February 1956. Which of course is always called the secret speech, although it seems to me it was secret for about 2 hours because the news gets out very, very quickly. And then not only is that the beginning of the opening of the Pandora's box about Stalinism, but it's a mandate for all of these other communist parties to have a conversation about Stalinism. And, when I was 30 years younger and reading through the transcripts of these writers' unions meetings in Prague, the thing that moved me or struck me was how devastated these writers were. And people got up there and said, listen, my generation, we grew up with Stalin's name. And my best friends, they went to their deaths in the Nazi camps with Stalin's name on their lips. Well, now you're telling me, well, no, I'm not going to apologize. I'm not ashamed. But eventually they had to work through this. And then the second thing that struck me was that they initially had no language, especially the ones who came of age during the war. They had no language to critique Stalinism that wasn't Stalinist language. Their whole language was kind of bound up, in this way of thinking. And it was a long, painful process. And I would say maybe most intensely between 56 and 63, where they were looking for another language to talk their way out of this. And I was trying to figure out, as a 23-year-old, 24-year-old, where this language was coming from, and as a non-native speaker of Czech who was struggling. And I started slowly to realize that a lot of it was coming from existentialism, that a lot of it was coming from Sartre and Heidegger. And one of the things they were doing was taking words like, in Polish you would say lud, in Czech you say lid, the people as a collective, and then you juxtapose it with ludzi, with lida, with people as the plural of persons. And that turns out to be a radical term. once you go from the people as a singular entity to the people as a plural of individuals, they started juxtaposing things like class consciousness with conscience. And interestingly, in Czech, consciousness is wiadomi and conscience is świadomi, which is in Polish, it's totally different. It's, świadomość in Lithuania. And so anyway, I found all these things very interesting. And that was the beginning of my insight into where this socialism with a human face came from, had to do with this rereading of Marx and Hegel now through the prism of this other philosophical tradition. So it's an encounter. It's an encounter among these traditions. And of course, what revisionist Marxism was about was, especially initially, it was not about getting rid of Marxism. It was, if something went wrong, if there was some fault in the blueprint, then it was because we didn't read Marx carefully enough. Like that was.
What we didn't read?
I'm sorry?
We
Didn't read carefully
Marx.
enough.
Okay.
Yeah, no, the impulse was you went back and read more intensely. So you put aside Stalin, you go back to Lenin, you put aside Lenin, you go back to Marx, you put aside the older Marx who was more deterministic, and then you go back to the younger Marx who was more concerned with the problem of alienation and how alienation could be overcome through praxis. You go back to Hegel, and now you're rereading Hegel through Heidegger, which is what Koja was doing. And so you get this encounter among these different traditions. And so what these chapters are really looking at, and of course all sorts of other things are going on, is this encounter, the Marxist Hegelianism encounter with phenomenology and existentialism, and how we get to a point of, ultimately the question that had been the question of, what is truth and can we get to truth? And now they're going to really fixate on that question of that boundary between determinism and responsibility. Because you're not throwing out historical determinism entirely. You're not saying history doesn't matter. But you're trying to create a more robust space for the human subject and for human agency. And how do you do that? Like, where possibly do you figure out where that border is between how much are we embedded in the historical structures in which we find ourselves, and to what extent are we free agents making free choices? And I mean, the intuitive, obvious answer to that is obviously that both of those things are going on at any given moment. But somehow, both here, it turns out to be very radical. And I was interested to find out, or to observe in my own country as a footnote, that in its critical race theory version, it also became very radical. Critical race theory, which became a kind of demonistic thing of the right in the United States, was basically just a version of revisionist Marxism saying there is such a thing as historical structures. We inherit certain historical structures that are bound up with various kinds of xenophobia and racism, and it doesn't mean that we're not making choices or we don't have agency, but we don't start from a tabula rasa. We're not hanging out in a frictionless world. There is no such thing as a frictionless world. We don't start to act from nowhere. We're always in a certain place, in a certain time. We're born into a world that has been inherited, and from that place we're acting, which really is just kind of common sense. But somehow in both of these cases turns out to be very radical, and then exactly how do you find this space? And Kosik for me was one of the most interesting thinkers, and he, like Tishner, is really working with this idea of drama in theater and the relationship between actors and playwrights and staging, and where does the agency come from, and do you start the play not knowing where it's going to end? Okay, so I think maybe I've said enough, and I'll let other people jump in.
Okay, so I will maybe just start one of my comments, maybe from questioning a little bit that story of kind of on the one hand Marxist theory having this one strand, and on the other, phenomenology / existentialism, and kind of being the alternative. Because I keep thinking, and of course I keep going back to what I know more, which is Soviet story, and especially Soviet-Lithuanian story. But, you know, existentialism was allowed into Soviet and socialist space in a very, very peculiar and particular form, which was Sartrean.
Yeah.
Sartrean, okay, if you want Simone de Beauvoir,
Yeah.
but Heidegger but Kierkegaard, no way. And why was that? Because of course Sartre was faithful to socialist project, at least that's how they perceived. He was very happy to visit the Soviet Union, be chaperoned around, have some lovers and whatnot, and and then the systems. Oh, okay, this is the pre-approved thinker using, but he's pre-approved because he's not threatening the ideological conventions that we have. So that for me, I think is important to keep in mind, because this is not then that divide of Marxist theory against phenomenology existentialism is a bit questioned. At the same time also, when I keep thinking about existentialism, especially Sartre, for Sartre this was, I don't want to use too this kind of dismissive of a term, but this was an episode in the 40s. Not even before and not after, certainly not after. From the 50s, he's not an existentialist by any stretch of imagination. He's a political thinker. Political, not existential. Simone de Beauvoir, late 40s, she writes, we're not existentialists. Please do not mistake us for that. So he's traveling with all this political agenda in the best sense of the term, so I'm not doubting that he believes in the communist project or Marxist project, so we can debate the details of that. But those, I don't know, poor souls in Soviet or socialist camp, they see him as some sort of, so now we can talk a little bit about this existentialism, because this Sartre is kind of a slogan or the marquee sign, but we don't really, we don't. So that for me is also a question of the space for thinking. How much is it allowed? And of course, everyone talks about this thaw, and yesterday was also Khrushchev, as you mentioned. 60s, this is kind of, it opens up, but to me it's always, it opens up in the sense of, strict regime prison, where after 20 years of just beating them every day, the prisoners then suddenly say, from now on, we'll allow you once a week for a walk. And everyone's, this is fantastic, this is heaven, thank you very much, this is a really nice prison. But it's still a prison. And why I say that, because of course thinking about freedom in prison is an extremely strange thing. I've never served time in prison, but incidentally in July I was invited by a friend who has a project in prison. She goes there to talk with prisoners, and she asked me to come, and I said, okay, and what do you want me to talk about? She said about freedom. And I said, are you, I don't know how to talk about freedom with prison. I really do not know. And I tried, but thankfully they talked more than me, because I wasn't ready. And so for me, I always, when I think, especially about 60s, because in the 50s, it's easy to say, in Stalinism, I think it's easy to, so this is clear, there's no deception, so to speak. We know where we live. This is, you say a bad word, you're killed. And so it's black and white in many ways. And so for me, 60s is much more, because it's almost, it's seducing you into, so now you can, and even in Russian cultural space, we talk about the 60s is some wonderful time, some unbelievably beautiful. There's explosion of arts and culture, and it's almost like let's go back to the 60s. I talk about it because, of course, in Sartre, one of the most important cultural events in the whole of Soviet Lithuania was Sartre's visit. And of course it's a bit later than this period, it's early 70s, but it was almost mythical. They would keep talking about Sartre.
Famous photo.
Famous photo of Sutkus in Nida. Sartre is working on the sand dunes, and of course he cuts out the Beauvoir because we don't need women in the picture, Sartre is on his own. So all that, but it was mythical. And then you think, yeah, but that guy is chaperoned by KGB. and he's just, and I'm pretty sure he wasn't even aware that it's Lithuania. He was visiting Russia because that's, it's all Russian space. So that for me is extremely important to keep in mind. I think when we talk about, especially the 60s, because it's so seductive to start thinking, because of course we're comparing it to Stalinism. Well, I'm not so sure that that's the right comparison. Or maybe that's definitely not the only one possible. So that for me, and another thing is I was thinking, of course, about, so I don't want to get too technical about philosophical stuff, but one thing that was definitely lacking, and I don't know the reason for that, in socialist camp, so there were quite a few versions of Marxism, and even that was quite typical, especially amongst Sovietologists, to talk at least about two versions of Marxism. The Marxists for career, so they would just parrot whatever the party line was saying at the time, and honest Marxists. And honest Marxists, very often they would get beaten by the party because they would have an unorthodox version. But what I struck, at least, maybe I don't know, but I keep thinking at the time in Germany, what we now know as Frankfurt School of Critical Theory keeps going, but it seems somehow unreflected in socialist camp, or at least I don't know anyone who would have engaged. And that, my guess, and that's only a hypothesis, that's another proof that they were sourcing only those guys that you were allowed to source. And that's where it becomes all this Sartre's existentialism, and specifically Sartre. Because Kierkegaard, you cannot talk about Kierkegaard. Why? Because it's just too much about religion. So it's just not a thinker. That's it. So, and suddenly everyone, so Sartre, great existentialist thinker, but Sartre, and so my hypothesis is that Sartre becomes that because he's allowed to be that. And why is he allowed? Because he's still faithful after Stalinism. He's faithful to the socialist project, unlike someone, for example, like Camus or even Foucault. I've seen a debate in some kitchen. It's a film where Foucault, but Sartre was not there, but Foucault, someone else, maybe Derrida, they're talking about, and Foucault says very clearly, it's 60s. He says, you cannot approve of Soviet Union when you know about Stalinism. You cannot when you know what happened in Hungary. You cannot when you know what's happening in Czechoslovakia. Sartre is happy to do that. Sartre is just, tries to show this historical necessity and whatnot. And suddenly then you see, everyone in Soviet or socialist camp is influenced by Sartre. But maybe because he's the only one that's there on the menu. Yeah, so that's that. I could talk more about. I would love maybe a bit later talk about freedom, about the concept of freedom. But maybe I'll during the discussion, because I think it's important, but also it depends what content we put into that. and I think it's for example, Sartre and Kierkegaardian concept of freedom, they're different, although they lump together as existentialists, so that's kind of one position. But so yeah, I'll stop here.
I'm going to jump in there because a couple things that you reminded me of. One is that it seems that the position of Sartre is a little bit shadowy in the book. So I mean, I think the obvious answer to what Victor is saying is that yes, Sartre made it Sartre opened some kind of public possibility, but the actual characters in the book were engaging in their own intimate personal ways with, the sources of existentialism back when Sartre was, not born. But the thing with Sartre in the book though is a shadowy personality, and we don't really know quite how to evaluate him. He sort of turns up. Like in my view, Sartre is a double collaborator with both National Socialism and communism, and not particularly heroic at all, which raises questions for, the politics of pre-post existentialism. But for me, he's very much not a heroic character, not only because of the communism part, but because of the National Socialist part as well. Not that he was a National Socialist, but he did not play a heroic role during the German occupation. And but he, in the text, he kind of functions as somebody that readers are supposed to already know about. A little bit like they're in the position that Victor is describing, where like in the 60s, everyone is allowed to know about Sartre, and so the reader is also kind of supposed to know about Sartre. Like Sartre is sort of a statue that gets moved around on wheels a little bit in the text, but you don't, unless I'm forgetting, which is very possible, I don't think you ever actually roll us into your own understanding of who Sartre is and how we're supposed to evaluate Sartre. And I mean, if you're doing, you could say what Victor says, you could say, well, it doesn't really matter who Sartre was, and because he's just kind of this symbol. He's somebody you write letters to and so on. He's somebody who shows up at the beach. But you could do that, or you could kind of tell us your take on Sartre. But I think in the text it's kind of in between, we're sort of expected to know who he is. And since Sartre did in fact face, and I think not at all heroically, a lot of the dilemmas that you're talking about, it's a little bit strange that we don't get a kind of moral read on him. Maybe your characters didn't know him well enough, and that's therefore it's outside the pale. But that's just something that I was thinking of. That Sartre is he's in this sort of, as you would say, kind of in a liminal space. He's not like, Marx, where we really do know who he is maybe, or Stalin, but he's also not one of the characters who you develop, and so we know who he is because you developed him. He's kind of in between. And you can't really count on contemporary readers having, a take on Sartre. I mean, the death of Sartre, the end of, Sartre was the last intellectual that everybody knew about, and now we don't know about any intellectuals anymore, and so you have to actually present who Sartre is. The second thing I was thinking about is prison, and I just have something very banal to say, which is that, because I did teach in prison, and I did actually teach several of these thinkers in prison. I taught Edith Stein in prison, I taught Kolakowski in prison, I taught the problem of freedom in prison. And prison is actually a much better place to teach about freedom than non-prison. So that would be my starting point, would be the intuition might be the opposite, that I teach the same materials to Yale students I teach to prisoners, and the prisoners actually do much better with them. and not only for the obvious reason that they have a lot more time to read, which is what any East European dissident would say, and did say when I told East European friends I was teaching in prison, they were like, oh yeah, your students will do all the reading. Yeah, they did do all the reading. But, and also, not only for the obvious reason that they're in prison, but because they're constrained by something, but I think also because prison, the way of being in prison poses questions differently about the body and about space, right? I'm not saying that it's positive or anything. I'm just saying that it's a way of living. It's a way of being in time, precisely. Prison is a way of being in time, and so people who are in prison, when they're given a chance, are able to engage with. So I'm not sure. So I think the intuition might be a different one, in fact. That's what I'm saying.
No, but I agree. It's just that my experience was that the words have a completely different way when you talk about freedom there. So that, So I think.
Yeah, I particularly had, we're not reading Wittgenstein, we're past that, but I particularly had a prisoner who, this incarcerated student, I should say, who was in love with Wittgenstein. Like as soon as he touched Wittgenstein, it's like, okay, this is the key to understanding. It was quite wonderful. Did you want to respond to anything now, March, or do you want to move on next time?
I could, but I think I talked too much, so let's.
You really haven't, so.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing, I could say a lot more about Sartre, but I won't, but one thing was that, like, these thinkers had, it's not just that Sartre was allowed in and Heidegger wasn't allowed in, because they were reading Heidegger. Like, Kozik was reading Heidegger. Kozik was very seriously reading Heidegger, and writing to Lukács about Heidegger and, writing to Marcuse about Heidegger. But they had some personal access to Sartre. Like, Sartre would sometimes show up. And they didn't to Heidegger, which is interesting. Like, there was even Patočka, who, as we'll see in a couple days, is insanely generous towards Heidegger. Like, when he goes to Freiburg, he doesn't get in touch with him. Kozik is writing, Kozik, whose German is very good, is writing these letters to Lukács, like, did Heidegger read Marx? Did Heidegger read history and class consciousness? He's writing to Marcuse, who studied with Heidegger. No one wants to touch Heidegger. Heidegger's alive, right? Like, but Heidegger's alive. You put a letter in the mail, but nobody there is a kind of. It's not that they don't. They seem to have access to text, in some way, even if it's kind of underground. But there is a kind of taboo on any kind of direct engagement, which is interesting.
Can I just one comment, because I wouldn't doubt that they read, and I wouldn't doubt that they read even Kierkegaard. So especially those guys, they would have access to text. It was difficult but possible. But another thing is what you write, what you publish. And there was always a lot of self-censorship, a lot of that, because it's just you cannot mention, or things you cannot say, things like that. So, and again, I stress, what I was saying, it's more of a hypothesis than a thesis, because I think more research should be done on that, but yeah, that's my impression.
I'm sure you know this story, and I'm probably getting some of the details wrong, but speaking of what you said yesterday about things coming late to Russia, Dugin ruined his eyes trying to read Heidegger directly from microfilm. in I think the late 1980s.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a Lithuanian philosopher who's still alive, but he was the one who brought a lot of French thinkers in the 80s to Lithuania. I was always curious. So Levinas, for example, he translated Ricoeur. And I was always, why is it him? Why was this guy? And then it turns out, because he was allowed to go to France. Why was he allowed to go to France? Because his uncle was a functionary in French Communist Party in the 80s. So he managed to go to Paris, he went to a bookshop, he bought some books, and then he was in the know. He comes back and he talks about going to Moscow to a library, somewhere in Lomonosov, I don't remember which school, and getting hold, so that's where the also Heidegger's Sein und Zeit of a copy, and reading it there, he can't take it on. It says, the most interesting part, he said, were the margins, because there was a lot of comments by different people. So he said, so that might be, the one copy they all were using.
Christoph, did you want to add some thoughts?
I'm thinking how different situation we had in Poland comparing victories in Soviet Union, because we had Camille, from Camille, not only Sartre. And more from the 60s, I think, or Giedroyć published his Rebellious Men, I think, even in the 50s. And I like this presence of Sartre in our discussion in the book, because it is like a mirror with Camille. So, like, I like to have Arendt versus Heidegger. that something else is possible. And so Paris in the 50s, for me, it is a lost Miłosz alone, who couldn't find a common language with Sartrean people at all, but he has Camille as only friend in Paris at that time, the only person we can talk with and to understand each other. And why it happened, why it was possible for Camille, because for me this mirror is like talk about the truth, like Sartre tends to do, and to live in truth, which Camille did. And the same for me is also between Arendt and Heidegger. Yes, you have people living in truth and people just philosophizing around that. And I think it's the dynamic of all your book, Marcy, what I love, that you put ideas as a theories in the context of practical life, because I don't have capacity to just cut off the life, real life, with the ideas, and then you test all. Yes, and then you see how it goes, how it makes people's choices and decisions and the human stand in that. So when I think, and of course. The background of Camille is living in a poor family, being a son of workers, yes, and very poor people. And I think this is something what helped him to see clearly what communism and ideology in the East is, that he didn't receive it, communicate with that as with ideology, but it was something about human, stand in that, which was not the case of this salon, Paris salon of Simone de Beauvoir and the others. Yes, for them it was all abstract things. They can enjoy themselves, praising Stalin and communism, but didn't cost them at all. It was nothing. Yeah. That was just about theoretizing things. It makes me think what you wrote and quoting, I think, Patočka, that the existentialism is like a reaction to the disillusion of communism. Yes, that at least there was a link in this. In that, but it's still around how you could be disillusioned. You can hide it in a way of hypocrisy, like Sartre did, because he never spoke about this delusionment. And you have people, on that side. The same is with Heidegger. Yes. The same, like with Sartre, they never criticize themselves for the mistakes they did, possibly. Yeah, you never have them like making this inner self-critical reflection. Yes, that you expect somehow. We were or Eliade. There are people like UNESCO, for example, who can make immediately criticize of the stand towards the fascism in Romania and just threw it out, yes. And you have Eliade who will stay till the end of his life with this, like a shadow, never abandoning it, and never.
It's such an interesting figure, Eliade.
Yes, in that context, yes. So. Why it was not like that? That of course you can make mistakes, you can be disillusioned, but still you don't make this real change, you know, in and letting people know about your transformation and purification of for that. Something I think Miłosz was very honest with that. He was always even too critical to himself, you know, and taking too much on his burden as a guilt. And it leads me to what you write about, Marcy, that action always brings guilt. Yes, and because we should, that's why I'm telling about that you should have some capacities, because if you are in action, if you are public intellectual, if you are Oriental politician, you do a lot of action. Yes, and it's like a big burden, yes, and you should, because sometimes it appears it's so spontaneous, it's so unpredictable, and so on, that it appears that it could be wrong, yes, or it went, you know, to the wrong direction. And the question is what you will do with that, yes. And Arendt has two answers, yes, forgiveness and promise, yes, that we should do something with the past, and we should reconciliate with this in a way of and so on. But at the same time, and I love it even more, that you should project some new ideas, things as a promise for the future, that you should do something new in your life with your ideas, in something which will promise something else and different what it was. Maybe it is the most difficult thing, that you just even forgiveness. I think it's easier somehow, because the most difficult thing is, okay, this what we accumulated was possibly wrong or not perfect and so on, but we give to ourselves the chance to start from the scratch and to build some new promises of that. And I think that's a problem with these big ideologies, that there was no promise after that. Yes, that there was no new horizon after all of that. So that would be my general reflection.